My name is Heather Leslie, and I'm director of the Darling Marine Center at the University of Maine, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the third and final virtual summer science seminar that we've hosted this summer. And this afternoon, or this morning, I should say, I'm the featured speaker. So I've invited a colleague to introduce me and also to host the question period to follow this talk. This session will run well less than an hour, and it's great to see so many of you joining from the Darling Center community, from Orono, from our neighboring communities. Thank you all for joining us. And Cassie, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Heather. Good morning, everybody. I am Cassaundra Rose. I am the Senior Science Analyst and Maine Climate Council Coordinator in the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future. And I'm delighted to be here with you today to help answer and monitor questions and to introduce Dr. Heather Leslie. Heather is the director of the Darling Marine Center, the University of Maine's Marine Laboratory, and is an associate professor of marine sciences in the University of Maine's School of Marine Sciences. She's an international leader in marine conservation science and conducts research on the ecology, policy, and management of coastal marine ecosystems. She studies the drivers of ecological and social processes in marine systems and how to more effectively connect science to policy and management. So in this vein of connecting science to policy and management, I've had the real pleasure of working with Heather as the co-chair of the Coastal Marine Working Group of the Maine Climate Council for the last year. She and Kathleen Layden of the Department of Marine Resources led a diverse group of scientists, municipal and state officials, representatives of Maine's fisheries, marine industries, and aquaculture, and many more folks through an intense 9-month process to research and recommend strategies to reduce and adapt to climate change in our coastal marine communities and environments. She'll be telling you a little bit more about that process, I believe, this morning, and I'm happy to answer any general questions on the process and to share some links to more information as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Heather.
Great. Thank you so much, Cassie, and thank you all again for joining. I'm going to share my screen, and if all goes as I expect it to, this presentation should be about 20 or 25 minutes, so we should have plenty of time for questions. Can we just change it to the view mode here? Cassie, does that look right? Is it showing up?
That looks great.
Okay.
And I just wanted to share, I forgot to earlier, that you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit questions during Heather's talk.
Great. Thank you, Cassie. So again, welcome everyone to the final Summer Science Seminar at the Darling Marine Center. I'm delighted to talk today about climate science and action for Maine's coast and coastal communities. And the goal of this talk is to share some up-to-date information on climate science that relates to Maine's coast and ocean, and also to encourage and invite you to participate in the ongoing process to craft a climate action plan for Maine. As Cassie said, I've co-led the Coastal and Marine Working Group over the last year. That's been a great privilege and honor. And I see this as essentially an invitation to all of you to participate in that process, which is very much in progress. I'm not going to spend much time talking about the details of how our group of 38 working group members came together or how we did our work. If you're interested in those types of details, I would encourage you to look at the Coastal and Marine presentation that we made to the council proper last month. Or actually I should say in June. Just to take a step back before I get into the recommendations that we're offering to the council, as we're all well aware, Maine's coastal communities are facing rapid and substantial environmental and economic change. And this situation has only been exacerbated by the pandemic. And part of that change, certainly not all of it, is related to global climate and how it's playing out here in our local environment. And as someone who lives just 6 miles up from the Darling Center, right outside this mud flat in Newcastle, this is an image of the Damariscotta River from Newcastle, one of the most productive clam flats in our river. I'm seeing for myself these changes to Maine's climate, and I'm also hearing from my neighbors as well as from climate scientists throughout our state and world about rising ocean temperatures and rising air temperatures in our state. We're also seeing longer summers and shorter winters, and finally increases in storm frequency and intensity. And while we can't point at any particular event and say this is due to climate change, when you look at long-term data sets, particularly over the last several decades, you see both here in Maine and globally these very strong trends, and they're already impacting our communities and businesses. You don't need to go any farther than the parking lot on the other side of Schooner Landing here by the Damariscotta and Newcastle Bridge to see the impacts of sea level rise. Members of the community in Damariscotta, particularly the municipal leadership, have been working really hard for a number of years to prepare for the rising sea levels here in the Damariscotta River estuary. And they have been substantial. Within the last century, we've seen a foot of sea level rise, and the prediction before 2100, reasonable predictions suggest that it could be as much as 3 to 5 additional feet that come our way here in Maine. And so a big part of what the Climate Council work has been about these last months is learning from the great local examples like the work that's going on in Damariscotta relating to protecting the downtown area from sea level rise, trying to learn from those examples and figure out how we can scale them up and bring them to other places in our state. We also know that ocean chemistry is changing. And here's a picture of a larval lobster, a baby lobster, which is one of the many shell-forming organisms in our ocean that are impacted by ocean acidification and specifically coastal acidification for the species that are close to shore that are so important to our economy and our ecosystem. And already we're seeing that these changes in ocean chemistry are impacting how people run their fisheries and aquaculture businesses. The expansion and growth at Maine aquaculture industry, particularly Mooksy Farm just up the road, the new facilities they built to buffer the impacts of ocean chemistry here in the estuary are a good example of this. And again, we want to build on these examples of things that people are already doing to make their businesses and their communities more resilient to climate change and figure out ways to help people get the information they need to adjust and adapt. And finally, a really important change to flag before getting into the strategies is how the value and diversity of Maine fisheries, wild-caught fisheries, have changed, particularly in the last 20 years. Here's a figure that shows data from the Maine Department of Marine Resources between 1950 and 2010. And there's a lot going on here, a lot of different species that are landed by Maine fishermen. What I want to bring your attention to is the big red blob on the right, lobster. And we see through time that there's been increasing reliance on lobster and that more lobster have been caught in recent years, and this trend continues to present, than say in 1980 or in the 1960s when groundfish made up a much larger percentage of the volume of catch. And we heard earlier in this series from Bob Stenick about the reasons for this rise in lobster landings and also the challenges that it poses to Maine coastal communities, the fact that we're so dependent on one species now. And so certainly climate impacts are part of this story, and scientists at the University of Maine and other institutions around the region have done a lot of really good work to understand the ecological aspects of this figure and why it is the way it is. But those dimensions cannot be separated from the social and economic dynamics. And that acknowledgement of the connection between the social and the environmental factors that lead to patterns like fisheries landings, that was a really important aspect to the working group activities and the strategies that we've developed over the last months. This is just to drive home the point that coastal communities are really foundational to Maine's identity and to our economy. I flagged a few different types of impacts related to Maine communities and fisheries in the last few slides, but those don't fully represent the value of these resources to our state. $5.6 million was contributed in recent years by coastal tourism. And there wouldn't be the tourism industry that we have today if it wasn't for the thriving ecosystems and human communities like the Port of New Harbor here that we have in Maine. Also, 45% of Maine residents live in coastal and island communities. These aren't just places that others like to visit. These are really important places for many of us. And so given the significance of coastal communities to Maine, the Maine Climate Council, well, actually the governor and the legislature who established the law that created the council, they saw fit to have this group that's focused particularly on coastal and marine. The other working groups, just to lay it out quickly for you, the other working groups are more topical, but you see in yellow here, the coastal and marine working group is the only one that's really about a particular place in Maine. And I want to focus in on what our working group is offering in terms of strategies to the council in the remaining slides here. A couple orienting comments about the process. Maine Climate Council is at the top of this slide. They're the body who's actually drafting the action plan, and that work is happening in the coming months. Those of us at the bottom of this slide, the working groups, the coastal marine one in yellow, and then the other 5 that you see there, we've been working the last year to learn about what the state of the science is, learn about how people have built on that science and done innovative things to address concerns about climate change impacts and make their communities more resilient. And we've also had input from the Science and Technical Subcommittee as we do our work. I'm sure the other 37 members of the Coastal Marine Working Group are very happy to know that the biggest part of their task is done. Now, Kathleen and I need to convey the report that was written by our group to the council members and be available to answer questions. But the real work of the working group occurred over the last 9 months through the pandemic and a lot of other challenges. And for that, I'm really grateful. The goals of the Maine Climate Council and ultimately the action plan that the council is developing are fourfold, and they're briefly mentioned here. The first focuses on emissions reductions, and specifically reducing the state of Maine's carbon emissions by 45% by 2030 and up to 85% by 2050. So pretty bold emissions reductions. Secondly, there's a commitment by the legislation that enables the council to ensure that the strategies that are put forward make Maine people and industries and communities resilient to climate impacts. And as part of that, number 3, grow good paying jobs in the transition to this lower carbon economy and make sure that workers who are most impacted by climate change are well supported. And finally, the 4th goal of the Maine Climate Council and Action Plan is to ensure that Maine's rural, low income and elderly populations are not adversely impacted either by climate change nor by the actions that we take in order to mitigate and adapt to climate change. The Coastal and Marine Working Group developed 6 sets of strategies over the last 9 months, and I want to briefly take you through each of them. In order to learn more about the details of these strategies, I encourage you to go to climatecouncil.maine.gov, and you can read our whole report. It's over 100 pages, but you can get the gist in the first 10 for sure. And you can also complete a survey where you can share your ideas about how these things could be implemented, as well as your concerns. If there's something that I share today that you have a real problem with, the council needs to know. And I invite you to log on at climatecouncil.maine.gov and be part of this process of crafting an effective climate action plan for our state. So the 6 strategies are listed here. I'm going to go through them, so I won't read the list in front of you. Strategy number 1 focuses on tracking climate impacts to support adaptive decision making. And the idea here is to establish a state-level climate collaborative that brings together coastal and ocean monitoring in a way that ensures that there's not redundancy, that the money and the time of people involved are well spent, and that the monitoring that is done really informs people's decisions at the local to regional level about how to cope with and adapt to climate change. And importantly, this strategy would leverage existing programs that are led by a wide range of state, nonprofit, university, and citizen science groups. And there's a couple examples of that here on the slide. These are scientists from the Maine Department of Environmental Protection and the Maine Department of Marine Resources, excuse me. And both of these groups are actively monitoring habitats and species that are impacted by climate change and using that information to inform future stewardship and ensure that people are able to access and have the resources going forward. The second strategy focuses on providing technical assistance and outreach. And the idea is that there's all this good information being collected through monitoring efforts like the ones I just mentioned, but that's not enough. We need to make sure that that information is being made accessible and able to be used by people who are in the process of making decisions. So through the Coastal and Marine Information Exchange, the idea is to provide coastal and marine stakeholders with accessible and relevant information and decision support tools to make decisions about how to restore or replace a parking lot, for example. You know, when is it time to do that? Businesses need different types of information than municipalities or individual homeowners do, and that's where the Maine Seafood Business Council will come in. The idea there is that Maine fishermen and shoreside businesses and other people involved in working waterfronts will get the information and tools they need to focus their investments, to make operational decisions, and also to plan long-term. And when I've shared these strategies with trade groups in the recent past, I've heard that this is a tremendous need. That sure, there's all sorts of great information out there, and they know, fishermen and other working waterfronts constituents know that people are available to help, but when you try to navigate what's currently available, it's not very easy, or I was told impossible in some cases. And so creating a business council that ensures that information gets to people in the format that they need it could be a good idea. I'd love to hear what you think. Strategy number 3 is focused on enhancing mitigation by conserving and restoring coastal habitats. And the idea here is to leverage the carbon that is stored or can be stored in coastal and marine environments and have it count toward our offsetting of Maine's emissions. So the first thing we need to do is figure out how much carbon can be stored in habitats like the salt marsh shown here, and for how long is that storage really happening. And then we can begin to develop programs where we can encourage habitat conservation and restoration through formal carbon sequestration or carbon permitting programs. So this strategy focuses on ideas around that. And number 4 goes a bit beyond that the blue carbon issue and focuses on nature-based solutions more broadly. And by that, I'm referring to ways that you can restore or conserve salt marsh or other natural habitats, and also ensure that human communities are able to protect themselves from coastal storms and sea level rise and other concerns like that. So this 4th strategy really complements the 3rd and is focusing on ensuring that municipalities have the information that they need in order to think creatively and effectively about nature-based solutions in coastal rivers and shorelines and marine habitats. Strategy 5 is one that I wanted to be sure to highlight today, given the interest in Maine fisheries and aquaculture among many listeners. This strategy is focused on managing for resilience of Maine's seafood sector. And again, in talking with fishermen who are contributing to the council work already, it's clear that this needs to be a multifaceted set of strategies, that there's a need for information to be available in useful formats, but also for there to be mechanisms where existing and emerging businesses are able to get the support they need in the face of the climate impacts that we're already seeing. And finally, the working group has highlighted that it's really important to think about having stability in terms of our regulatory environment, but also creating space for people to be able to adapt to environmental changes. And this is particularly important in light of the emergence of both invasive species, but also warmer water species, some of which have become significant fisheries in recent years. And so we're seeing already that we have experience as a state in how to manage in an adaptive fashion for changing fisheries, and figuring out how to build upon those examples and ensure that we can support resilience of these industries going forward is captured by this strategy. And finally, strategy six focuses on working waterfronts more broadly and includes suggestions about financing infrastructure improvements, how to do that sustainably, how to invest public funds well, and also how to improve guidance and technical assistance for municipalities and business owners that are active in working waterfront settings. And so just to wrap up before moving to your questions and comments, I want to highlight a few of the resources that you can go to if you're interested in digging more deeply into this topic. I think in the chat you can see the PDF of this presentation, so you can log on there and get these links live. The first two documents here really describe the state of the science, and the first one is written for more of a popular audience, so I'd suggest starting there. And then you see there the Coastal Marine Working Group's link at the Maine Climate Council. That's where you can go and provide comments on what I've shared and on the details that are on the website. If you're trying to figure out how to be a constructive contributor to this conversation, and I would encourage you to look at the Maine Climate Table. It's a pretty interesting organization with a really wide array of participants. It's not an environmental organization or an industry organization. It's a place for people to come together. And finally, if you'd like to learn more about the climate science that we do at the Darling Marine Center, our link is at the bottom of the page. And with that, I will stop sharing and would be happy to take questions and comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather, and thank you to everybody who's submitted questions so far. I'm going to be looking through them and summarizing where possible. So I'm going to start off with a summary of a couple of questions I saw come through, and that's to ask you, Heather, if you could talk a little bit about how scientists distinguish between natural climate cycles or natural climate change that we might expect and human-caused climate change. How do we know the difference between those two things?
That's a really good question, and the answer is that like most forms of research, we use multiple methods. So first of all, it's been really important to actually get out in the field and make long-term measurements in how air and water temperatures and actually the concentration of carbon dioxide itself in the atmosphere has changed through time. So we have those empirical observations, in many cases, very precise observations, and we can see how these fundamental parameters of our world are changing. But there's often multiple causes for changes that we see in the world around us. And so that's where models become really important, that we can play out different scenarios or explore different reasons why the world is the way we observe it to be, and eliminate some possibilities. And so what we've learned through a combination of models and empirical observations, and to some degree experiments, but they tend to be really small scale, is that there's unequivocal evidence that the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in recent decades is due to human-caused activities. And so given that scientific consensus, we are in a strong position to figure out what to do about it and how to manage and mitigate that trend.
Thanks, Heather. And actually, my own PhD research focused on looking at past climates and why climate changed over time. And I've found it really interesting looking at the work of scientists who've been looking at our climate over the 19th, 20th, 21st centuries. They've actually been able to show that with looking at natural climate forcings, we can tell that after about 1960, the human-caused signal really starts to rise above the rest in terms of explaining the patterns we see in temperature and sea level rise. So there's a lot of really robust scientific research out there that sort of starts to tease apart these natural and human-caused variables. And so climate scientists are really confident that this is human caused, and it is because we're putting more greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. So thank you to Kevin, who submitted some questions that helped me craft that question. The next question is, and I could probably help with this, Heather, if you want some help. Can you talk about the involvement of local legislators in this work and how local residents and officials could inform and advocate our representatives and senators to help accomplish priorities in Augusta?
It'd be great if you could speak from the whole council perspective about legislative involvement.
Happy to. Yes. The Maine Climate Council has bipartisan, bicameral involvement at the Maine Climate Council level and in each working group and the scientific and technical subcommittee. So I'm going to translate that jargon. What that means is that we had legislators from both the Maine Senate and House and both members of the two major parties. Apologies, my cat wants to really learn about climate change this morning. We had members in each of the working groups, the scientific and technical subcommittee, and then we have two members of the Senate and the House on the Maine Climate Council itself. Actually, the legislation, the governor's legislation was introduced by a Senate Republican into the Maine Senate last year. And so it was passed unanimously out of committee. So there's very strong bipartisan support and involvement in the Climate Council. And we also had municipal officials in each working group as well. The legislation that created the Climate Council was really set up to make sure that we're trying to get as much representation and voices from around the state as possible. And so that was really built in to get state and local involvement. And in terms of how local residents can inform and advocate representatives and senators, I think reaching out to them, once you learn about the strategies that you care about, let us know, but also reach out to your representatives and senators to tell them what you think about them and how you would like them to implement the recommendations of the Climate Council once the plan is delivered to the legislature on December 1st. So public feedback and involvement is going to be really important throughout the process of putting the climate action plan together, but also that implementation next year once we get back into a long legislative session. So I would just say reach out, talk to them, have conversations, tell them what you care about. And then once they begin considering legislating next year, continue talking, continue that dialogue.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. That was a really great question. Next question, what are some examples of new strategies to manage for coastal resilience in Maine? I love this question.
That's a really good question. So I would start by making sure that we're all talking about the same thing. So by coastal resilience, I would interpret that term to mean the ability of people and the ecosystem they're part of in a place to deal with shocks associated with climate, but also other changes that we're addressing right now in our environment and economy, including the pandemic. So how do we enable coastal communities and support coastal communities and being able to adapt and manage and be resilient to changes in the world around them? Well, there's a wide array of ways to do that. And I think pretty much every one of the 6 strategies that I shared from the coastal and marine domain, resilience is integral to each one of them. And in particular, we recognized and heard from experts who came before our working group that ensuring that municipal leaders and homeowners have the resources they need to make good data-driven decisions at the local scale is incredibly important, and businesses too. And so that's what led to our group's emphasis on monitoring for climate impacts, including economic and social impacts, and also suggesting that we really need to pair that with technical assistance and outreach that are geared toward coastal communities and community leaders and coastal businesses specifically. I could go on and on about resilience, but I think I'll probably stop there.
Thanks, Heather. I'll say, I'll add to that in that one idea, and I'm not sure that it has been implemented, but I know that the Portland City Council has been considering some building code changes to ensure that, particularly on the peninsula, the first level of new buildings are built in such a way that they can be safely flooded in the case of a strong storm surge or sea level rise. They're essentially managing for some level of flooding, and that's an area that's particularly vulnerable to going to be vulnerable to sea level rise because it's fairly low lying in a number of areas. So I think that's one interesting example that's coming out of Maine. It's something I've actually shared with other states, talking with representatives from other states. But there's a lot of really great thinking going on and creative thinking going on. And we're trying to learn from other states who particularly have been impacted by coastal storms in recent years to get some good ideas about how we can also try to manage for resilience with climate change. So this next question, I think might be a good one for me to take. And that is, what is the current status of funding for implementation of the various strategies outlined in the plan and the overall timeline? So I think it's helpful to talk a little bit about the timeline here. The 6 working groups have made recommendations to the Climate Council, and the Climate Council members, there are 39 of them, are considering those strategies and which ones to put in the final climate action plan from now through early December. And so December 1st, we're going to have the climate action plan with our recommendations. And a few of the working groups actually did make some recommendations for potential funding strategies that could be used to implement some of the mitigation or adaptation recommendations. And so the energy working group in particular has talked a lot about that. The transportation working group talked about that. But it's a really thorny, tricky issue, particularly with the challenges from the COVID-19 pandemic having such devastating impacts on state and local budgets. And so this is something we're going to have to think about really creatively, and we're really trying to also get feedback from Maine people on, what ideas you have, what you're comfortable with. I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation in particular. So right now, the status is we're at the ideas stage. We're thinking about things and coming up with recommendations, but then it's going to be up to the legislature and the governor to actually implement any sort of funding strategies. I don't know if you want to add to that, Heather.
Well, I guess just to but budgets are a grim subject right now, but I do think there's real hope in this regard because so many pilot projects are underway that have already been funded through a wide array of state and federal sources, as well as private sources, and putting those different resources together. And even now, just thinking about the research that and the science that informs a lot of this work, scientists like those at the Darling Marine Center and at other entities around the state, we continue to submit proposals for competitive federal grants and to have conversations with private foundations who were interested not just in supporting climate-related science, but resilience projects that will make a difference for Maine communities and businesses on the ground. A recent example of that actually comes from the federal government. The U.S. Department of Commerce just made an award to the Maine Technology Institute for the support of a roadmap for Maine's marine economy. And if you Google MTI marine economy, it'll probably come up. That's an example of within the last 6 months, there's been significant federal resources that are going to an industry-led effort to plan for the changing world that we're facing, not just climate related, but thinking more broadly about the dynamic environment that Maine's marine businesses are operating in. So while the current work is in development, there's some really good things that are already out the door, and I'm optimistic that we'll continue to see that progress.
Thanks, Heather. And you actually remind me of a couple of things I meant to mention earlier, which is that the Maine Climate Council has engaged the Eastern Research Group to do a number of independent analyses of the costs and benefits of the different strategies recommended by the working groups, as well as of vulnerability assessments, which we're calling the cost of doing nothing. Because climate change is ever accelerating with rising greenhouse gases, it's costing us more and more. You know, the cost of doing nothing on climate change isn't free, as we hear over and over. And I've found it interesting that the federal government actually has done an assessment of the costs and the savings of investing in pre-disaster mitigation. And what they found is that for every dollar that you invest to reduce your vulnerability to the impacts of natural disasters like storms and storm surge and a number of natural hazards, you save $6. So there's a 6-to-1 return on investment in investing on reducing your vulnerability. That's kind of there aren't a lot of studies out there like that, but that's a really great indication of real data for for how worthwhile it is to really make these investments now, as opposed to later when we're feeling further impacts from climate change and cleaning up after a disaster. So there are a lot of great additional questions coming in. And so there are a couple of questions about coastal communities. So when we talk about coastal communities, what does that cover geographically? And does that landscape fluctuate over time with the impact of climate change, for example, in times of heavy flooding?
That's a really good question. So often the analyses that are being done are based on current and projected sea level. And so, for example, I think the work that Cassie cited earlier in terms of Portland and looking at vulnerability and how building code change would be beneficial, those are grounded at least at a broad level in assessments of predicted sea level rise. And there's been some great work done by the Nature Conservancy in partnership with folks at Bowdoin College and other institutions to develop those maps in a way that are specific to coastal communities throughout Maine. So if you're interested in a decision support tool, I'd encourage you to check that out. Other analyses are done at the coastal community level, and actually my colleague Joshua Stoll at the University of Maine and I have led a project in collaboration with folks at Maine DMR and Maine Sea Grant And part of that has involved looking at what Josh has termed port sheds. And that's the idea that there are places that, well, coastal ports that are really important, particularly related to our working waterfronts and seafood economy. And we can trace through a combination of fisheries data and demographic and economic information where these regionally significant ports are. And just like you can think about watersheds and how rivers and mountains create watersheds, you can also think about port sheds where people are who are dependent upon a particular access point or significant series of access points to the coastal ocean for fisheries and other activities. So I think that's probably more complicated than Caitlin wanted, but the answer is there's a lot of different ways to define coastal. It might just be coastal counties, but we also are thinking increasingly creatively about not just using environmental information to define the coastal area of influence, but also social and economic information, like Josh Stoll's port shed concept.
That's really interesting. That's a great concept. I'd love to learn more about that. Thank you, Caitlin. So here's an anonymous question, but I'm really curious to hear the answer. So what are the changes in the numbers and types of fish being seen in the Gulf of Maine? It seems this data would be helpful in creating sustainable policies. And I know our scientific and technical subcommittee has done a little bit of work on this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yes, so I would encourage the person who sent this note in to check out the chat and to look, I think everybody can see the chat, right? And look at the resources from the Science and Technical Subcommittee and also the Fernandez et al. Climate Futures Update, because there's some really nice synopses about changing marine ecosystems and particularly commercially important species. We get these data on changes in on the number and the composition of species in the Gulf of Maine a few different ways. One of the most important ways we get those data, and I showed you this at the beginning of the talk, is from fishermen themselves through fisheries landings data. So the Maine Department of Marine Resources has data going back a number of decades where we can track changes in the diversity and the volume and the value of different fished species. And actually through the same project I mentioned before, the Maine Coastal Community Resilience Project that Josh Stoll and I lead, we've been able to work with the department to combine that state level information that fishermen have gathered and sent to Maine DMR every year with federal fisheries landing information, because many people in Maine fish for both state and federally managed species. So if we want to get a more complete picture of what we can learn from fisheries data, we need to put those state and federal data together. That being said, there's a lot of things that we don't fish or eat that swim or crawl or live in the ocean. And so gathering information through other means, through underwater surveys like the scuba surveys that Darling Marine Center scientists conduct for lobster and to monitor coastal habitats more broadly in Maine and up and down our coast, using remotely operated vehicles like what are used to explore deep sea habitats, and also other boat-based ways of surveying ocean life are really important complements to fisheries data, because without those other types of data, we don't really have a sense of what the whole ecosystem looks like or how it's working. So while fisheries data are absolutely essential and are a really important indicator of how these systems are changing, we also need to look at information that's gathered in other ways. And if you want to see that information, I'd say log on to the Maine Department of Marine Resources website, or feel free to reach out to me directly, and I'm happy to point you to some of those other sources of information that don't focus on fisheries data.
Thanks, Heather. So the next question is from Richard. And he asks, it seems like the coastal group's actions are more towards resilience and adaptation and less on the mitigation and carbon figures that are the goals of the council in general. Will blue carbon initiatives be fast enough in their results?
That's a really good question, Richard. I'm going to hope that Cassie can provide some of the technical details, but I guess what I would say as someone who's not a geologist or a chemist and thinks about the degradation rates of carbon in mud in the ocean, what I would say from a big picture view is that this is part of the puzzle and part of the solution. That for sure it's important to think about how much carbon is captured in oceans, like what we heard about from Megastapa a couple weeks ago, and the flow of that carbon through coastal environments and how that can help us meet our goals of reducing carbon emissions. And because ocean environments near the coast are so productive, there is a role, it appears, for blue carbon. But I will let Cassie speak to the timeline question more specifically.
Yeah, so I think you made an astute observation, Richard, in that the Coastal Marine Group did think a lot about how to adapt to the effects of climate change. But there were some fantastic presentations by members of this group about one really interesting facet of coastal marine environments, which is that our coastal marshes, wetlands, and those sorts of environments are actually the most efficient types of environments Maine has, period, at burying and pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. And so that's even if you, so that's called blue carbon. So that's considering wetlands versus forests. And we often think in Maine about our forests sequestering a lot of carbon, and they certainly do so. But that's because we have such a huge amount of forest. But in terms of, if you look at how efficient acre per acre a coastal wetland is versus the forest, the coastal wetlands actually sequester orders of magnitude higher amounts of carbon. So they're really, really great at sequestering carbon. We just don't have as many of those environments because we have a really rocky coastline. So the Coastal Marine Working Group, I know, thought a lot about trying to preserve those environments that we do have against not only the effects of climate change and sea level rise, but also development, to make sure that we maximize the amount that those environments can continue sequestering carbon. So we want to make sure we protect them so they can keep being a great sponge for carbon. But also those environments have this great co-benefit in that they protect communities and homes against flooding as well. They're not only a carbon sponge, they're just a great sponge in general. They tend to absorb floodwaters really well. So the Coastal Marine Working Group really put forward that blue carbon strategy to not only mitigate our emissions, but also as a protection measure. So as my husband says, you're feeding two birds with one seed. You are achieving a lot of different goals with one action. So you're getting a lot of bang for your buck in protecting these kinds of environments. And I think they're fairly fast at bearing that carbon. I would defer to Bev Johnson over at Bates College, who's really the expert in this area, and does a lot of fantastic research on that. But it's pretty good at it in terms of timelines. But it's just a matter of maximizing the limited area that we have to keep burying carbon. So let's see, looking back at the questions, there is a great question from Parker Gassett. He says that living shorelines work is particularly hard in Maine, Maine specific general permit. Will climate change related efforts prompt us to change living shorelines permitting or Army Corps permitting?
I believe that fits under the strategy set 4, the nature-based solutions set, and perhaps also with strategy set 3. And for sure, that's an issue that the working group members that were drafting those strategies addressed. I can't summarize the specific regulatory recommendations at this point. And indeed, one of the things we flagged as an entire working group was the need for further analysis of existing regulations and alignment of our recommendations with existing regulations. So I'd say, Parker, by all means, send a comment on that point. If you see something missing from strategy 3 or 4, send a comment on that point to Kathleen Layden or myself, and we'll make sure that it gets to the council.
Mm-hmm. And I want to say that the Community Resilience Planning subgroup also thought long and hard about how climate change is reflected or not reflected in a lot of the rules and regulations in Maine statutes. So I'm not sure that they talked about living shorelines at all, but that might be another great place to look at and make some comments. So there have been a few great questions about sea level rise coming in and talking about what causes sea level rise and how we map it. So Heather, would you feel comfortable talking about, what are a few main causes of sea level rise, and why do we worry about the high tide mark when we're trying to map sea level rise and its impacts?
I'm happy to start, and I'm guessing you're going to have complementary knowledge you can offer, and this might actually be
Absolutely.
a great last question to wrap up with. So sea level rise is a complex topic. There's not a singular factor that's causing sea level rise. For sure, rising temperatures in our atmosphere and our ocean contribute to sea level rise through the expansion of water, but also the melting of ice that's in our that's on land into the water can contribute to sea level rise. And then there's also processes that are originating from the land itself, where some coastal lands in particular are subsiding. And so global rates of sea level rise due to atmospheric or ocean or ice considerations may not tell us the whole story about what's going on. And a difficult example of this is in the Chesapeake Bay region, where there's some areas that are subsiding very rapidly for multiple geological reasons, and therefore local rates of sea level rise are not necessarily reflective of the global rates. Cassie, can you go deeper on that for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, it's a complex topic, but I'm thrilled to say that we have a really fantastic update to the sea level rise chapter of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee report that we're aiming to release it by end of August, early September. So I highly recommend anybody who's interested in learning more about sea level rise to sign up for our newsletter, and then once that report comes out, read the sea level rise chapter. But we have some fantastic scientists at the Maine Geological Survey and the University of Maine who go out and continuously monitor sea level rise, do fieldwork every year, and comb over the data. I know for a fact they look at the tide gauges every day because I get emails about it. But what I've learned from them is that one of the big concerns about sea level rise is not just that sea level is going to be higher all the time, but you have to think about things like what happens when our sea level is a foot higher and then we get a storm surge on top of that. So I know Kevin submitted a couple of great questions about, why do we worry about the high tide mark as opposed to the low tide mark? Well, when we have really high like say a king tide in general, sea level rise adds on top of that. So I know that last October, for example, we had a king tide. We had a really strong natural tide. We have really big tides in the Gulf of Maine, some of the biggest in the world. And then we had a storm on top of that. And fortunately, the storm hit at a point in the tide cycle where the tide was just a little bit lower. It was going out as the storm surge was coming in. If the storm surge had happened just an hour or two later, it would have broken sea level, local sea level records all across the coast of Maine and resulted in some really significant flooding. So with sea level rise, we're expecting not only a rise in this sort of storm surge related flooding, but we're going to have sort of sunny day flooding, nuisance flooding, where particularly our coastal roads that are right next to the water that might get flooded occasionally now, they're going to get flooded more and more days in the future, which is why it's so important to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere and to reduce our warming. We are locked in for a certain amount of sea level rise because it takes the ocean a long time to heat up and it takes it a long time to cool down. So it's going to keep heating up even after emissions stop rising. But with luck and policy changes, we will hopefully minimize the amount of sea level rise that we're going to experience from climate change. As I said, the STS chapter has way more details. It's really well written, and I'm super excited to release it in a month or so, and I hope that you all check it out. Well, with that, we have a few more questions, but I know that Heather and her team will be following up on them later. And please visit the climatecouncil.maine.gov website, sign up for our newsletter, take the feedback surveys, let us know what you think. And we're also on social media and all doing really cool stuff every day during the week. So I hope you'll follow us and engage there as well. And thank you, Heather, for allowing me to join your great conversation today.
Thank you for moderating and contributing. This has been fantastic. And thank you all for joining and participating. And please do log on to climatecouncil.gov and also feel free to reach out to me directly at heather.leslie@maine.edu if you have follow-up questions or ideas. Have a great day, everyone.